Welcome to Jargon, a podcast bringing clarity to commonly misunderstood business concepts. We're debunking and simplifying the buzzwords and ideas plaguing today's business world and offering a fresh perspective on these topics.
Hello, welcome to another episode of Jargon. My name is Todd Boutte. We're going to flip the script a little bit today, and I'm going to interview one of the founders of Trinergy, who is normally the host of this podcast, Bill Aimone.
Hey, Todd, how are you?
I am great, Bill. Today, we wanted to introduce something that's brand new on our site. It's an additional handbook that we've added to our kind of ever-growing library of handbooks at Trinergy. This one is called What to Do Post-ERP. And so just real quick to our audience, I wanted to introduce kind of the concept of handbooks and how they came about and what we hope everybody gains out of those. Could you tell us more?
Yeah, really, we put the handbooks out there, and they're basically free to anybody that wants to download them and use them. Really, it's a resource for companies who just want to get some general ideas on how to address different topics like ERP, merger integration, setting up a business operating system, or even ERP evaluation. So we put that information out there as a free resource for companies to use, especially if they want to do some of the work internally and accomplish some things by themselves before they actually want to hire consultants, or maybe they just don't need to. They have enough internal staff to get this stuff done. So it's a resource for organizations who just need some guidance on how to address some things.
Well, that's great. And so how do you think this handbook fits in with the others? Or maybe why this?
Well, so one of the biggest issues we see out there is, first of all, we did an ERP evaluation handbook, which kind of weighs all the different ERP solutions that are out there in the market and gives an unbiased view about those. But then one of the things that we've seen over and over again and problems we've had to address are ERP implementations that did not meet expectations. So typically companies put in new business systems, ERP systems to do accounting, project management, manufacturing, automation, asset management, you name it. Any type of new business systems they put in to manage their business. And typically the implementations don't always meet the expectations of what was sought out. Initially, you have a software vendor that maybe shows you how things work in a perfect world. Well, no company is a perfect world. So how do you make these business solutions, ERP systems, work for a company so that it meets expectations or even exceeds expectations and does the things that you originally intended to do? So really what we're talking about here in this post-ERP world is how to fill the gap between the business case that was put forth on the ERP implementation and align it with reality.
Right. And before I neglect to give everyone a place to follow along at home, these are all found at trinergy.com/handbooks. And I'll hopefully remember to share that again at the end. So, hey, one of the pieces of sort of jargon, not jargon, that you mentioned earlier was business operating systems. So that's used a couple times in this handbook. What is that, Bill?
So it's essentially your playbook on how your company operates. So if you think about it, there are things that your company does around how do you operate. There are your policies, your procedures. There's your control framework. All of the pieces of how the company operates, all the norms, all the expectations, the performance metrics, all those things really culminate into a business operating system. And so when we talk about business operating system, I'm not talking about technology per se. I'm talking about how does the company operate? What's important to the company? How do they execute and how do they deliver? And putting that in a package, what we call business operating system, which is a totally different handbook that we can dive into at another time.
Okay, perfect. Good. So, there's a handful of things in this handbook that are very prescriptive to do. And as a matter of fact, it's outlined sort of in 6 steps. And I have those listed here that we'll talk about. But one of the things that jumped out to me right away is how long we talk post-ERP. What's your opinion on sort of how long post-ERP should this sort of assessment be looked at?
Well, it's really less about how long, because I look at this in 2 ways. One is there's an assessment, which should be quick, but then there's actually making those improvements. And we always advocate for a continuous process improvement framework. You're not going to go in and review an ERP system and go, oh, here's the 20 things we need to do. Let's go get them done and we're perfect. It's always taking that continuous process improvement perspective. And that's what we advocate for in this handbook as well.
Perfect. So with that in mind, I mean, one of the biggest pieces of this is the process improvement sort of process, and we'll talk to that. So, we laid this out in kind of the 6 pieces, right? Establishing guiding principles, running through process improvement visions, establishing a RACI, which is a matrix we need to talk about, setting your performance metrics, your service level charters, and then your initiative charters. So again, if you're following along at home, of course, this is all in the handbook. Please don't do it while you're driving. But let's walk through those 6, Bill. So how would someone go about kind of setting out their guiding principles?
Well, first of all, probably first question is why even do that? What is the value of even doing that? I think that's kind of what you're getting at, Todd.
Sure.
People go, well, why do we want to set guiding principles? We've put the ERP implementation down, but really
we thought we were done.
Yeah, right. It's really setting the parameters. And a lot of cases when we start an ERP implementation, we'll put guiding principles in place. But what we're saying is, if you've done them already, take a look at those guiding principles. But what is driving the need for improvement? What's important to the organization and getting those priorities down? You know there's a mission and vision for the company. But how do I then take it in the context of what's going to guide me for improvements? What's more important? Process, controls? How do I prioritize things? Why am I making these improvements? Is it for control's sake or is it for growth's sake? Why are we doing this? That's what the guiding principles do, answer the why. Why are we doing this, and give people guideposts and how to operate when they're making improvements. For example, I might have a guiding principle that says we're not going to make all our changes at once. We're going to have continuous process improvement. Another company might say our guiding principles is to get everything done by the end of the year. I mean, so it sets the goalpost and the goals and the objectives for the ERP and process improvements.
You know, one of the things that's hard to do in an audio medium is kind of point out how we apply these things in our handbook, and you'll find a list of do's and don'ts kind of in each section to help everybody along here. So let's say you establish your whys, you get some answers as to why. What is kind of the first step in this process improvement or continuous improvement vision?
Yeah, so that's really the second step. If you didn't do this during the ERP implementation, this typically involves what is our vision for process improvement as I look at different processes. So for example, I look at the procurement process. What do we hope to achieve and what do we expect to look like from a procurement perspective? Not just from a systems perspective, but also from a process and organizational perspective. Your vision for how our requisitions and purchase orders going to be executed. Who's going to do it, ultimately? Where are you going with that? Are you going to have buyers executing purchase orders? Are you going to have a centralized shared services procurement organization? Are you going to try to automate how you interact with suppliers through requests for proposals and things like that? What capabilities, specific capabilities, do you want each process area to have? So, for example, I talked about procurement. There's your order to cash process. How do you process orders? Are you going to drive towards consistency? Are you going to drive towards customization for your customers? What are the expectations and goals specifically around how are you going to use the technology? How are you going to deploy the organization? And what's the process going to look like? So setting that vision going forward. And hopefully you did it part of the ERP implementation. You can just dust that off. But if you didn't, it's time to do that, because then that drives and helps you prioritize your improvements and where you need to go.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that last point, that process improvement visions are near and dear to our heart over here as part of the selection process. And we would hope that everybody sort of has gone through that exercise prior. But if not, now's the time. Because everything in this sort of post-ERP phase is about really honing in on kind of getting the best out of your system.
Yeah, and sometimes we're talking about backing up a little bit, not just jumping in and going, oh, we have all these problems, let's go address them willy-nilly. This is about getting organization around it and putting a process around the process.
Right. Well, that dovetails nicely into the next step here, which is the RACI. Now, this is a very valuable tool. This is a matrix that we can apply to really any problem set that establishes who's responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. So that's the RACI, right?
Yeah, and I know we're throwing some more jargon out there, but really that RACI is, you always look at it as a big matrix, and going down the left-hand side are your individual processes and things that you do. And then across the top, the columns are the people or departments in your organization. And it's really going through and mapping who owns what, who's accountable for things. So who owns procurement? Is it owned by operations at the plant level? Is it owned centrally by a procurement department? Who owns the close process? Getting specific about who owns that, because then you want to know who's going to do it, who's responsible for getting the work done, who's involved and consulted along the way. So mapping all those out so it's clear when you develop your processes and you make those improvements, first of all, whoever owns it. So if you're making changes to your ERP, post-ERP around the procurement module, well, who's going to make that decision and who's going to own that? Who's actually going to go do it and make those changes? So you really need to map those out and identify roles and responsibilities, because the last thing you want happening is two different people coming in with a request to make changes to how a customer orders process, and they conflict with each other. Or you make a decision on the procurement side that impacts accounts payable and they're in conflict. So you really got to align who owns what processes and you know who's involved in it, because you might say any changes to procurement, you might want to consult or inform accounts payable because it impacts them downstream. So aligning the organization around roles, responsibilities. So when you're driving out decisions around making post-ERP improvements or any improvements, you know who owns that.
Yeah, and it's amazing to me what we can see as we start to put a company through this exercise, where you can see maybe a variety of overlaps where there's a lot of redundancies, or you might see a bunch of gaps in this matrix where you realize nobody's been consulted about something that they should and could care about. So this tool can be applied to really any situation, which we love it for that.
Yeah, so many times we go through this process and you find out there's two people that think they own something. Then they got to go back and the executives go back and arm wrestle with each other and decide who's going to own that. So it's more prevalent than you think.
Right, or the inverse could happen. You ask the room and there's crickets. Oh, realize nobody's been accounting for this situation whatsoever. So yeah. It's great. And we really like tools that get companies looking inward. You know, obviously that's one of the things they ask us to do is help them look inward, right? But it's amazing how often they can get something really valuable out of a simple Excel file.
Yeah.
So, okay, so moving on here, we've got kind of step 4 outlined as performance metrics, right? Well, that sounds real simple on the page, but in terms of post-ERP, what does that mean to you?
Well, so many times you put the ERP system in and the biggest complaint, I can't get the information I need out of the new ERP system. We put all this stuff in, we can't get the information we need. Well, the question is, what information? Do you know what you need? And really defining before you start just saying, hey, let's create a bunch of reports and let's bring a developer in to build a bunch of Power BI stuff, sitting down and really aligning around your performance metrics. And you don't know how many times we see an organization, they might say, well, we need to see gross profit or net income or whatever it might be. Simple stuff that sounds so simple, gross profit. I know what that is intuitively. I can look at a textbook and look that up. But organizations aligning around what are the components of gross profit and what is and what isn't. And then how do I want to look at gross profit? Do I want to look at it by geography, look at it by service line or by product? All those different ways I want to look at things, getting alignment around what you want to see. You can go forever, for years, developing reports on reports on reports, still not getting what you need. But really aligning on your performance metrics. What are the things you want to see? How are they calculated? And where's that data going to come from? I'm mapping that to your ERP system. Typically, the data's there. If you implemented the ERP system, I'll say 70% correct, the data is probably in the system somewhere. But aligning those performance metrics around what data is in there and then saying, well, wait a minute, there's some data elements. We can't get gross profit by customer because we're not capturing our costs by customer. Well, how are you going to do that? How are you going to get there? Those are the things that come out of that process of defining your performance metrics.
Well, yeah, and before we get to the last two on here, one of the questions I've kind of been sitting on is basically the risks of not using this thought process as you go through a selection and this post-ERP phase. So are there some examples or potential risks that you see prevalently, in the industry of people not going through this pre- and post-assessment phase that are common?
Well, the big thing is if you don't put organization around it and thought around it, when I start talking about defining, your guiding principles, vision and all that stuff, what I typically see, every department creates their own long list of stuff they want the ERP to do, and they end up spending, let's say they spent $2 million implementing the ERP system. They end up spending a quarter of that or a third of that every year making enhancements and changes to things that aren't driving to the value case that they wanted to get out of their ERP. And what I mean by that is it's almost like death from 1,000 paper cuts. I can sit there and poke at you and go, I need this change, I need this change. So the IT department gets all these modification requests, and there's hundreds of them. There's this backlog of them. There's no organization around it. That's where I see the common complaint is IT organizations say, we don't have enough people to get all these changes made. So they put in a lot of stage gates into getting these changes done and worked on and everything and approved. There's really no cohesive way to tie it back to, why is this important? Why did accounting need a modification to some screen? Okay, and I give the best example I see is someone needs a modification to the screen, and it's somebody who's very loud in the organization and carries a lot of weight, and they get it done, and they never ask the question of, what is it going to do for us? Well, it's going to save me 2 hours a week. Well, that modification costs $50,000 or something. Things like that you really don't prioritize properly because you don't have it tied back to some prioritized vision.
So let's see, if we put this out, this is going out to the world ideally here. So are those some of the symptoms you might look for somebody that needs to say, pause and run through these kind of exercises? What other kind of symptoms might there be?
I think the primary one is just that endless thing. The other piece of it too is the resistance to using the system. Because people will say, you know what, it's more difficult for me to do X. I mean, everybody, when they get a new system, anytime you get a new system, even when you get a new app on your phone, for crying out loud, maybe there's some improvements, or Apple makes an upgrade on your phone, and you go, well, this has changed. I don't like this. This is harder. It's more difficult. But then as you start using it, you realize, oh, it's not so bad. I'm used to it. You become accustomed to it. With any new system, you see the symptom of people just complaining about it. And usually they say, I didn't get enough training, which, yeah, maybe you didn't. You probably did. You just weren't paying attention. Or you just don't like the way it's being done. Or maybe it asks you to do a little more work. And I think part of the stepping back it enables people to understand and see that we've gotten value out of the system. Yeah, we got some people that maybe aren't happy with it, but overall we've gotten value and it's progressed the organization and it's helped us collaborate better. So we step back to a RACI and you go through that process for an accounts payable manager who says, I don't like this new system because purchase orders are X and they do this and make me put all this information and I've got to, do all this matching and everything to get everything right. But if they start seeing the value and understanding that they're involved in the decisions that are being made to update the system, and they're involved in designing that and developing that vision and saying, look, the reason why we put this other information in is because it's helping us reduce our cost of goods sold and it's improving our margins by this much money, then they start realizing, wait a minute, I'm seeing value out of it now. It's not this, behemoth system that I have. I'm actually getting value out of it. Yeah, I've got to go into 2 more screens to execute a purchase order or to make a payment. But you know what? It's worth it to the company because they're getting value out of it. I understand it. My boss is happy with it. And by the way, if I need more staff or I need to train some people, I'm going to get the tools I need to get there.
Right, and that's a very small piece, but a good look at some of the most important pieces of change management that we kind of propagate through projects as well, right? And keeping people informed of how this is going to make a bigger impact and actually asking and listening to their feedback, becomes huge.
Yeah.
Well, great. So let's not neglect the last 2 steps here. We've got 2 related to charters. All right. So service level charters and initiative charters. How do you close out these last 2?
Well, I know they both have the word charter in it, but they're markedly 2 different things, Todd. And let me talk about the service level charters first. What invariably happens in organizations, and we talk about this a lot in our business operating system handbook, every organization has departments like accounts payable, procurement, order entry, shipping, etc. Those departments do things for other departments, and those departments get things done by other departments for them. So there's this relationship between departments that in most organizations, it's largely not well understood. Shipping doesn't know what procurement guys do. The sales guys don't know what the project management guys do or the engineers do to get things done. So I might have a relationship between sales and engineering that say sales brings a deal in, engineering needs this information to be able to progress and help scope the deal. What are the expectations from sales so that engineering can fulfill those needs? So those charters outline expectations between departments to get things done. And those are critical for any organization looking at process improvement. So if, for example, I am the financial reporting department that provides management reports to people, and I request a modification to a bunch of reports, but nobody needs those reports, or if somebody is critical for people to need, because that's part of what I do to serve operations, I'm going to then bubble up that requirement and that need to develop those reports above other stuff because it's important to operations. And I have that in my charter. That's why I exist as the financial management reporting person or the FP&A department in the company to serve a customer inside the company, and this is their expectation. And so I can use that to drive change across functions to say, it's not just the financial reporting guy requesting this, it's operations requesting this too, because they need it as well. So it's getting those symbiotic relationship between departments put down on a single piece of paper, this is what I do for you, and getting them to go, yeah, I understand what you do for me, I agree.
They agree is a big part of it too. Yeah,
I agree, or I don't need this report. You don't need to give that to me anymore, so get rid of it. That's the other thing is kind of rationalizing reports, rationalizing stuff that you do.
Yeah, the collaborative piece of this is so huge. Often things get developed in silos for an individual department, and they and they realized how little value it has outside because they didn't actually ask the other department. They just dump reports that direction and realize, well, through a process like this, nobody actually looks at these. Why are we, we find out we're wasting a bunch of time.
Exactly.
Fantastic.
And now you alluded to initiative charters, and let me hit on that last. So typically when you go through this process of looking at process vision, all the things you need to do, all the work that needs to be done to get the ERP to where it needs to be, is organizing that work into initiatives. And what we mean by that are mini projects. So you might have a mini project. We're going to create some Power BI reports to give operations customer profitability stuff they need. You might have another initiative that's around re-engineering how requisitions are used in the system and creating approval workflows. That's another initiative. Really, it's a chunk of work that has a defined start and end date. It's got specific goals. It's got a problem statement, and it's got an owner, and it's got a business case. That's essentially what that is. So when you think charter, I almost think of it one page. It's a one-page thing that says, this is what we're doing. And really how you tie all this together is there needs to be some governance and program management around post-ERP improvements. You can't just go and say, hey, everybody go do stuff. It's putting some governance around it and managing it so that when requests come in, there's a process. When people need to make changes to the ERP or people want to make process improvements, there's a process for communicating that, managing that, and getting it done. Now, that doesn't mean we're adding bureaucracy. We're just adding a means for doing it so people know how to do it and know what to do. So they're not going off doing it by themselves and then, I fix one problem and then I break another problem. So that's really what this is all about, is coordination and collaboration.
And that's perfect, because one of the things I wanted to close with is where you might recommend the ownership of this particular process falling in a company. Where might somebody look to get some of this underway?
Yeah, so I typically see a lot of this start in one of two areas. One is IT, where IT is just drowning in requests. The other area is the controllers or finance organization, where they are at the crux. They're downstream of everything. So if anything doesn't work for the ERP system, they're typically the ones putting the Band-Aids on stuff to get things right, and they're feeling the pain. But they're also accountable for ensuring there's a control environment in the organization. So those things typically get driven by controllers, IT people as well, who are trying to put some control in place and a mechanism for organizing things. Those typically where we see it start. Now, I've got some clients where they started in operations, where the operations guys were like, oh, we got to use this system. It's horrible. We don't like it. What do we do? And so, it might start there. But it needs to be somewhere where there's some executive sponsorship of it. It doesn't need to be just someone running off by themselves. Now, we've helped some organizations set up kind of this idea of business optimization or program management office that may sit underneath an executive, whether CFO or CIO or whoever, it doesn't matter. It's really about that organization being charged with enabling process improvement, enabling continuous process improvement. It's been around for years. I remember back in the day you had, quality circles, the whole quality movement with Deming and all that stuff, and how you address that, and everything followed a process. It's very similar.
Well, that's great. And I think the reality of that answer sort of depends on the maturity of your organization, the size, and some other things as well. But I would encourage everyone to look through this handbook and the others. Again, those can all be found at Trenergy.com/handbooks. I really appreciate you letting me sit in the host chair today, Bill.
It's been a pleasure. It's always a pleasure talking to you. And as you guys know, Todd leads our technology services practice. So if any of you guys are out there, just struggling with IT type stuff, Todd's always a good one to bounce some ideas off of, whether it's infrastructure, Power BI, or ERP, technology, cloud, and all that stuff. He's a good guy to talk to.
Or just to listen to your IT guys for you. Sometimes that's all you need, right? Much appreciated, Bill.
All right. Thank you, Todd.
Thank you.